In 1571, the Ottoman Empire sent a message to the defenders of Famagusta. The city had just surrendered after 11 months of siege. The Venetian garrison, reduced to a few thousand starving men, had been promised safe passage in exchange for capitulation. The terms were generous. The defenders were to keep their weapons, their flags, their honor. But when the Venetian commander, Marcantonio Brigadin, went to formally surrender to the Ottoman general Lala Mustafa Pasha, something went terribly wrong. Accounts differ on what triggered the explosion. Perhaps Brigadin said something insulting. Perhaps Mustafa Pasha had always intended betrayal. Perhaps the Ottoman commander was simply enraged by the losses his army had suffered. 50,000 dead, according to some estimates, including his own son. Whatever the cause, the result was horror. Brigadin was seized. His nose and ears were sliced off. He was thrown into a dungeon and left for days without medical treatment. Then he was dragged into the public square, tied to a column, and flayed alive, his skin peeled from his body strip by strip while he was still conscious. He reportedly remained silent until the knife reached his waist. Then he died. Mustafa Pasha had Bragadin's skin stuffed with straw, dressed in the commander's own uniform, and paraded through the streets on a cow. Later, the skin was sent to Constantinople as a trophy. It remained there until Venetian agents stole it back nearly a decade later. This was the Ottoman-Venetian Wars, not a single conflict, but a series of brutal struggles that stretched across 3 centuries. Not a war between nations, but a war between civilizations, between Christendom and Islam, between East and West, between the greatest maritime empire of the medieval world and the most powerful land empire of the early modern age. On one side, the Ottoman Empire, which at its height stretched from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to Iraq. An empire of 70 million people, with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, with resources that dwarfed anything Europe could match. On the other side, Venice, a single city built on mud and wooden pilings in a lagoon. A republic of perhaps 150,000 people. A state so small that its entire territory would fit inside a medium-sized American county. And yet Venice fought the Ottomans for 300 years. It was the most improbable conflict in European history: a city against an empire, a republic against a sultanate, a handful of islands against a continental power. And somehow, impossibly, Venice survived far longer than anyone had any right to expect. This is the story of how they did it. To understand the Ottoman-Venetian Wars, you first need to understand Venice. Venice was not like other cities. It was not built on solid ground, for starters. The original Venetians were refugees fleeing the barbarian invasions that destroyed the Roman Empire in the 5th century. They took shelter in the marshy lagoons at the head of the Adriatic Sea, where the shallow waters and shifting channels made invasion nearly impossible. Over the centuries, they transformed this unpromising location into one of the richest cities in the world. Venice became the commercial hub of the Mediterranean. Venetian merchants connected Europe with the East, importing silk and spices from Asia, exporting wool and metal goods from Europe. They had trading posts in Constantinople, in Alexandria, in Beirut, in Acre. They controlled the routes that made long-distance commerce possible. By the 15th century, Venice was phenomenally wealthy. The city's population was only about 150,000, but its per capita income was probably the highest in Europe. The Venetian ducal, the gold coin of the Republic, was trusted across the known world. Venice had also built an empire. The Stato d'Am, the State of the Sea, stretched down the eastern coast of the Adriatic, across the Greek islands, to Crete and Cyprus. Venice didn't control vast territories like the land empires of the day. Instead, it controlled the choke points of the islands, the harbors, the straits where trade had to flow. This maritime empire was the key to Venetian power. Without it, Venice was just a city in a swamp. With it, Venice controlled the commerce of the Eastern Mediterranean. And that was exactly what the Ottomans wanted. The Ottoman Empire emerged from the chaos of Anatolia in the 13th century. The Ottomans were originally a small band of Turkish warriors, one of many fighting for territory in the power vacuum left by the declining Seljuk Sultanate. Under a series of brilliant leaders, they expanded rapidly, absorbing other Turkish principalities, crossing into Europe, conquering the Balkans. By the 15th century, the Ottomans controlled a vast swath of territory on both sides of the Bosphorus. Only one prize eluded them: Constantinople. Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, Christian, Greek-speaking, 1,000 years old. The city had survived countless sieges. Its massive walls, built in the 5th century, were considered impregnable. It had held out against Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and earlier Turkish invaders. The Ottomans had besieged it before and failed. But in 1453, the young Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, was determined to succeed. He assembled the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever fielded, perhaps 80,000 men. He built a fleet to control the waters around the city. He commissioned the largest cannons ever cast, monsters that could hurl stone balls weighing half a ton. The Byzantine defenders were pathetically outnumbered. Emperor Constantine XI had perhaps 7,000 men to hold 14 miles of walls. He sent desperate appeals to the Christian West for help. The help that came was mostly Venetian. Venice had a complicated relationship with Constantinople. On one hand, the two states were commercial partners. Venice had trading privileges in Constantinople going back centuries. The Byzantine capital was crucial to Venetian commerce. On the other hand, Venice and Byzantium were historical rivals. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Venetian forces had sacked Constantinople, a betrayal that the Byzantines never forgot. The Venetians had carved out pieces of the Byzantine Empire for themselves, establishing the foundations of their maritime state. Now, with the Ottomans at the gates, Venice faced a choice. They could send a major fleet to relieve the city, potentially saving Christian Constantinople but risking their commercial relationship with the Ottomans. Or they could hang back, preserving their options, and see what happened. Venice, characteristically, tried to have it both ways. They sent some ships, some soldiers, some supplies enough to say they had helped, not enough to make a real difference. When Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453, after a 53-day siege, a Venetian contingent was among the defenders. The Venetian Bailò ambassador and commercial representative was captured. He would eventually be ransomed, but the Venetian trading quarter was looted along with the rest of the city. The fall of Constantinople was one of the most significant events in world history. It ended the Byzantine Empire, which had lasted over 1,000 years. It gave the Ottomans control of the straits connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. It created a psychological shockwave across Christian Europe. For Venice, it raised an existential question. What would the Ottomans do next? The answer came quickly. Mehmed II, now called Fatih, the Conqueror, was not content with Constantinople. He was building a world empire, and a world empire needed control of the seas. Within years of the fall of Constantinople, the Ottomans were pressing against Venetian possessions. They absorbed the remnants of Byzantine territory in Greece. They took Serbian fortresses that Venice had hoped to acquire. They built a fleet, something the Ottomans had never seriously attempted before, to project power across the eastern Mediterranean. The First Ottoman-Venetian War began in 1463. The immediate cause was the Ottoman conquest of the Morea, the Peloponnese Peninsula in southern Greece, which brought Ottoman territory directly to the borders of Venetian-controlled areas. The underlying cause was simpler. Two expanding powers had collided, and there wasn't room for both of them. Venice entered the war with confidence. Their navy was the best in the Mediterranean. Their fortresses were strong. Their commercial network gave them financial resources that seemed inexhaustible. They were quickly disabused. The First War lasted 16 years, and it was a disaster for Venice. The fundamental problem was strategic. Venice was a maritime power. The Ottomans were a land power with a growing navy. Venice could dominate the seas, but they couldn't project significant force onto land. The Ottomans could sweep across territory on land, but they struggled to defeat Venetian fleets at sea. The result was stalemate, but a stalemate that favored the Ottomans. Venice could hold the islands, the coastal fortresses, the places that could be supplied and reinforced by sea. But they couldn't hold anything that Ottoman land armies could reach. Year after year, Ottoman forces nibbled away at Venetian possessions, besieging fortresses, cutting off garrisons, wearing down the Republic's resources. The war was also expensive. Venice was rich, but fighting a war against a continental empire for 16 years drained even Venetian treasuries. The Republic borrowed heavily, raised taxes, debased their currency. The commercial networks that were the source of Venetian wealth were disrupted by the fighting, and there were defeats. In 1470, the Ottomans captured Negroponte, the island of Euboea, one of Venice's most important possessions in the Aegean. The Venetian fleet failed to relieve the garrison. The defenders were massacred when the city fell. Venice lost the First War. The peace treaty of 1479 forced Venice to surrender Negroponte and other territories. They had to pay tribute to the Ottomans, a humiliation for a proud republic. Their dream of dominating the eastern Mediterranean was over. But Venice survived. That was the remarkable thing. They had fought the most powerful empire in the world for 16 years, lost, and were still standing. Most of their maritime empire remained intact. Their commercial networks, though damaged, still functioned. The war had established a pattern that would repeat for the next 3 centuries. Ottoman expansion, Venetian resistance, eventual Venetian defeat, but never total defeat. Venice would lose territory, lose battles, lose wars, but never lose everything. The city in the lagoon was harder to kill than anyone expected. The 16th century brought new challenges and new opportunities. The Ottoman Empire reached its height under Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566. Suleiman conquered Hungary, besieged Vienna, and dominated the Mediterranean. His navy, under the brilliant corsair Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa, became the terror of Christian shipping. Venice found itself increasingly on the defensive. They lost more territory, more islands, more fortresses, more of the network that made their maritime empire possible. They were also distracted by European affairs, participating in the Italian wars that consumed the peninsula for 60 years. But the Ottomans had their own distractions. Their eastern frontier was threatened by Safavid Persia. Internal power struggles consumed resources and attention. The empire was vast, but it had many enemies and many problems. Venice exploited every opportunity. They played the Ottomans against other European powers. They maintained their commercial relationships even while fighting wars. They rebuilt their fleet after every defeat, often stronger than before. The Republic developed a unique position in European politics. They were Christians who traded with Muslims. They were Europeans who dealt with the East. They were neutralish, always ready to make a separate peace, always looking out for their own interests. Other European powers resented this. The Pope accused Venice of putting profit over faith. The Spanish, who saw themselves as champions of Christendom, regarded Venice as unreliable at best, treasonous at worst. But Venetian pragmatism kept the Republic alive. They couldn't afford ideological purity. They couldn't afford crusading zeal. They could only afford survival. The Second Major Ottoman-Venetian War, from 1499 to 1503, was another Venetian defeat. This war saw the Ottomans deploy their navy more aggressively than ever before. Barbarossa's predecessors were already making the Ottoman fleet a serious threat. Venetian commanders who had always assumed naval superiority found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned. The Battle of Zanchio in 1499 was the first major Ottoman naval victory over Venice. The Venetian fleet was larger, but the Ottoman ships were faster and better handled. When the Venetian flagship caught fire and exploded, the battle turned into a rout. Venice lost more territory in the peace that followed. The pattern continued: fighting, bleeding, negotiating, losing ground, surviving. By the mid-16th century, it was clear that Venice could not defeat the Ottomans alone. The Republic was simply too small, its resources too limited. If Venice was going to survive as a major power, it needed allies, but allies were hard to find. The other Christian powers, Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, were more interested in fighting each other than in fighting the Ottomans. The Italian wars consumed European attention for decades. When those wars finally ended in 1559, Europe was exhausted. Venice began looking for opportunities to rebuild. They strengthened their fortifications. They expanded their arsenal, the state shipyard that could produce a galley in a single day. They trained their marines and their naval gunners. They knew another war was coming. The only question was when. The answer came in 1570, when the Ottomans invaded Cyprus. Cyprus was Venice's largest and most valuable remaining possession in the eastern Mediterranean. The island was rich, fertile, and strategically crucial, a staging point for commerce with Syria and Egypt, a base from which to project power across the region. The Ottomans wanted it. Sultan Selim II, Suleiman's successor, nicknamed the Sot for his drinking habits, was prodded into action by advisors who saw Cyprus as an easy target. The island was far from Venice, close to Ottoman territory, difficult to reinforce. The Venetian garrison was small. The invasion force was enormous, perhaps 100,000 men, according to contemporary estimates. They landed in July 1570 and quickly overran most of the island. Only two fortresses held out: Nicosia, the capital, and Famagusta, the main port. Nicosia fell in September 1570 after a siege of 45 days. The Ottoman assault broke through the walls after savage fighting. The city was sacked. According to Venetian sources, 20,000 civilians were massacred. The Ottoman commander sent the heads of the Venetian commanders to Famagusta as a warning. Famagusta would not surrender. The siege of Famagusta lasted 11 months. The garrison was hopelessly outnumbered, perhaps 7,000 soldiers and armed civilians against the Ottoman army of tens of thousands. They had limited supplies, limited ammunition, limited hope of relief. The commander, Marcantonio Bragadin, was a Venetian nobleman of about 50 years old. He was experienced, capable, and absolutely determined to hold the fortress as long as humanly possible. Every day he held was a day when reinforcements might arrive. Every Ottoman soldier killed at Famagusta was a soldier who couldn't fight elsewhere. Every week the siege continued was a week when the Christian powers might finally organize a response. The Ottomans threw everything they had at the walls. They bombarded the fortress with artillery. They dug mines under the walls and blew them up. They launched assault after assault, wave after wave of janissaries crashing against the defenses. The Venetians threw it all back. They repaired the walls at night. They countermined the Ottoman tunnels. They fought with a desperation that astonished their enemies. By the summer of 1571, the garrison was reduced to a few thousand men. They were out of food, nearly out of ammunition, dying of disease. 7 Ottoman assaults had been repelled, but there would be no 8th. There was nothing left to repel it with. Bragadin negotiated a surrender. The terms were generous, or seemed to be. The garrison would be allowed to leave with their weapons and flags. Ships would transport them to Venetian-held Crete. The civilian population would be spared. Bragadin accepted, and then, at the ceremony of surrender, everything went wrong. What happened next became legend throughout Christendom. When Bragadin arrived to formally hand over the fortress, Mustafa Pasha received him initially with courtesy. Then, without warning, the Ottoman commander accused Brigadin of murdering Turkish prisoners during the siege, a charge that was probably false or at least exaggerated. Mustafa Pasha flew into a rage. Guards seized Brigadin and the other Venetian officers. What followed was systematic torture. Brigadin was mutilated, his nose and ears cut off. He was held in a dungeon for days, then brought out for public humiliation. He was forced to carry sacks of earth, kissing the ground each time he passed Mustafa Pasha's tent. Finally, on August 17, 1571, Brigadin was taken to the main square of Famagusta and tied to a column. The Ottoman executioner began to flay him alive to remove his skin strip by strip while he was conscious. Contemporary accounts say Brigadin prayed throughout the ordeal. He died when the flaying reached his waist. His skin was stuffed with straw, dressed in his commander's uniform, and paraded through the streets. It was sent to Constantinople as a trophy, where it was displayed for years. The fate of Brigadin horrified Christian Europe. It became a propaganda tool, a symbol of Ottoman cruelty, a rallying cry for crusade. Even today, Venetians revere Brigadin as a martyr. His skin, eventually recovered by Venetian agents, is preserved in a shrine in Venice. But even as Famagusta was falling, something else was happening. The Holy League that assembled in 1571 was the most powerful Christian fleet ever gathered, bringing together Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and several Italian principalities under the command of Don John of Austria, the illegitimate half-brother of King Philip II of Spain. Don John was only 24 years old, but he was charismatic, ambitious, and burning with the desire to prove himself against the greatest enemy Christendom had ever faced, and he commanded over 200 galleys carrying more than 80,000 men, including the finest soldiers and sailors the Christian world could produce. The Ottoman fleet was equally impressive, numbering perhaps 270 galleys under the command of Ali Pasha. And the two forces met on October 7, 1571, at the entrance to the Gulf of Patras, near the Greek town of Lepanto, in what would become the largest naval battle in the Mediterranean since antiquity. The battle was a chaotic, savage affair that lasted for hours as galleys rammed each other, soldiers fought hand-to-hand across blood-slicked decks, and the crash of cannon fire echoed across the water, while thousands of men died in the churning, crimson-stained sea. Don John's flagship engaged Ali Pasha's vessel directly, and the fighting was so intense that the Ottoman commander was killed and his head raised on a pike, which sent a shockwave through the Turkish fleet, even as the Christian center pushed forward with renewed fury. By late afternoon, the Ottoman fleet was shattered, perhaps 170 galleys captured or sunk, 30,000 Turkish sailors and soldiers dead, and 10,000 Christian galley slaves freed from their chains in what was the most complete naval victory in centuries. The Christian losses were significant too, with perhaps 8,000 dead and twice that many wounded, but the strategic impact was clear. Ottoman naval supremacy in the Mediterranean had been broken for the first time since the conquest of Constantinople. The news of Lepanto set church bells ringing across Europe, from Venice to Vienna to Madrid, and Pope Pius V declared October 7th a feast day in honor of the victory, which he attributed to the intercession of the Virgin Mary. Venice celebrated with particular fervor, not only because Venetian ships had formed a crucial part of the fleet, but because the battle seemed to promise the recovery of Cyprus and perhaps even more. A turning of the tide against the inexorable Ottoman advance that had been swallowing Christian territory for 2 centuries. But the aftermath of Lepanto revealed the limitations of even the greatest military victory, because the Holy League, which had been held together by papal diplomacy and shared fear of the Ottomans, began to fall apart almost immediately as Spain and Venice pursued conflicting objectives. Don John wanted to press the advantage, to strike at Ottoman bases, perhaps even to recapture Constantinople itself. But Philip II of Spain was more interested in his possessions in the western Mediterranean and had no desire to pour Spanish resources into Venetian territorial ambitions. Venice, meanwhile, was exhausted. The war had been enormously expensive. Cyprus was still lost, and the Republic's merchant class was desperate to resume the commercial relationships with the Ottoman Empire that were the foundation of Venetian prosperity. The Ottomans, for their part, demonstrated their remarkable resilience by rebuilding their fleet within a year, producing new galleys at an astonishing rate and replacing their losses so completely that the Grand Vizier supposedly boasted that while the Christians had merely singed the beard of the Ottoman Empire, the Turks would grow a new one. In 1573, just 2 years after the triumph at Lepanto, Venice made a separate peace with the Ottomans, surrendering Cyprus permanently, paying a substantial indemnity, and essentially accepting that the great victory had changed nothing fundamental in the strategic balance of power. The other Christian powers denounced Venice as faithless and mercenary, but the Republic had no choice. They could not fight the Ottoman Empire alone, and their allies had proven unreliable at best. Lepanto remained a symbol, a moment when Christendom had united and triumphed, but its practical significance faded quickly as the Mediterranean world returned to the patterns that had prevailed before the battle. The 17th century brought a new phase in the Ottoman-Venetian conflict, one defined by the longest siege in history and the slow, agonizing decline of Venetian power in the eastern Mediterranean. The island of Crete, which the Venetians called Candia, after its capital city, was the last major Venetian possession in the region, a prosperous colony that had been under Venetian rule since the Fourth Crusade in 1204. Crete was strategically vital, controlling sea lanes between the eastern and western Mediterranean, and its loss would effectively end Venice's role as a great power in the Levant, reducing the Republic to a regional state confined to the Adriatic and its immediate surroundings. The Ottomans had long coveted Crete, and in 1645 they found a pretext to invade when Maltese corsairs attacked an Ottoman convoy and took shelter in Cretan harbors, allowing the Sultan to claim that Venice had violated their treaties by harboring pirates. The invasion force was massive, perhaps 50,000 troops, and it quickly overran most of the island. But the capital city of Candia, protected by some of the most modern fortifications in Europe, refused to fall. What followed was the Siege of Candia, which lasted from 1648 to 1669, 21 years of continuous conflict, making it the longest siege in recorded history and a testament to both Venetian stubbornness and Ottoman determination. The defenses of Candia were extraordinary, designed by the finest military engineers of the age according to the latest principles of fortification. With massive walls, angular bastions, deep ditches, and overlapping fields of fire that made direct assault almost suicidal, the Ottomans threw wave after wave of soldiers at these defenses, losing tens of thousands of men in assaults that achieved nothing, while the Venetians mounted sorties, repaired damage, and held on through year after year of grinding, attritional warfare. Venice poured resources into the defense of Candia, sending fleet after fleet to resupply and reinforce the garrison, fighting naval battles in the waters around Crete, and appealing desperately to other Christian powers for help that rarely came in sufficient quantities. The cost was staggering. Venice spent more than 100 million ducats on the defense of Crete, an almost inconceivable sum that drained the Republic's treasury and forced extraordinary measures, including the sale of noble titles to wealthy commoners who wanted to buy their way into the aristocracy. The siege became a cause célèbre throughout Christian Europe, attracting volunteers and adventurers who wanted to fight the Ottomans in what was portrayed as a crusade. And contingents came from France, the Papal States, Germany, and elsewhere, though never in numbers sufficient to lift the siege. The Duke of Beaufort, a French prince, died leading a sortie in 1669, and his death shocked the French court while demonstrating the savage intensity of the fighting, which had consumed an entire generation of soldiers on both sides. By 1669, Venice was exhausted, and the garrison of Candia was reduced to perhaps 3,000 effective soldiers, too few to man the extensive fortifications, while the Ottoman besiegers had been reinforced by the Grand Vizier himself with a fresh army of perhaps 30,000 men. The situation was hopeless, and in September 1669, the Venetian commander Francesco Morosini negotiated a surrender that allowed the garrison to depart with honor, carrying their weapons and flags, while the remaining Christian civilians could choose to leave or stay under Ottoman rule. The fall of Candia marked the effective end of Venice's eastern Mediterranean empire, leaving the Republic with only a few scattered possessions: the Ionian Islands, some Dalmatian ports, a handful of fortresses in Greece, remnants of what had once been a maritime state stretching from the Adriatic to Cyprus. The strange thing about Venice is that even after losing Crete, even after the centuries of defeats and retreats, the Republic kept fighting. The Mauryan War of 1684 to 1699 saw Venice launch its most ambitious offensive in generations, taking advantage of Ottoman weakness after their failed siege of Vienna in 1683 to reconquer the Peloponnese Peninsula, the Morea, and establish, briefly, a new territorial base in Greece. Francesco Morosini, the same commander who had surrendered Candia, now led Venetian forces to victory after victory, capturing fortress after fortress, driving the Ottomans out of territory they had held for 2 centuries, and earning himself the title of Peloponnesiacus for his achievements. The campaign was marked by both triumph and tragedy, including the bombardment of Athens in 1687, during which a Venetian mortar shell struck the Parthenon, which the Ottomans were using as a powder magazine, and blew off the roof of one of the most famous buildings in the world, causing damage that remains visible to this day. Morosini tried to remove the sculptural pediments as war trophies, but the tackle broke and the statues smashed to pieces, leaving only fragments that would later be carried off by Lord Elgin and others. Venice held the Morea for less than 20 years because the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, which ended the war, gave them the peninsula but not the resources to hold it, and the Ottomans returned in 1714 to 1718 to reconquer everything Venice had gained, demonstrating once again that the Republic simply could not match Ottoman power in the long run. The final Ottoman-Venetian War ended with the Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718, which stripped Venice of the Morea and left the Republic with only its Dalmatian possessions and the Ionian Islands, a shadow of the maritime empire that had once stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. By 1718, Venice had been at war with the Ottoman Empire, off and on, for 255 years, spanning 12 generations of Venetians and Turks who had grown up knowing no world in which the two powers were not enemies. The cumulative toll was staggering: hundreds of thousands dead, territories lost and recaptured and lost again, fortunes spent, and entire populations displaced or enslaved in a conflict that had reshaped the Mediterranean world. And yet Venice survived diminished, weakened, no longer a great power, but still independent, still proud, still the most serene republic that had defied empires for 1,000 years. How did they do it? How did a single city fight an empire for 3 centuries and survive? The answer lies in understanding what made Venice unique, not just its geography, though the lagoon provided natural defenses that no land army could overcome, but its institutions, its culture, its approach to both war and peace that allowed it to absorb defeats that would have destroyed other states. Venetian government was remarkably stable, avoiding the succession crises and civil wars that plagued other European powers, because the Republic was ruled by an oligarchy of noble families who chose the Doge through an elaborate electoral process designed to prevent any single faction from dominating. The Doge was not a king, he was more like a chairman of the board, presiding over councils of nobles who made collective decisions through debate and compromise, and this system, whatever its flaws, ensured continuity of policy across generations. When a war went badly, Venice didn't collapse into chaos or revolution. Instead, the same system that had led the Republic into war let it out again, negotiating the best terms possible, rebuilding and preparing for the next round. This institutional resilience was one of Venice's greatest assets, allowing the Republic to absorb shocks that would have been fatal to states dependent on individual rulers. Venetian finances were equally sophisticated, drawing on the commercial wealth of the city to fund military operations through loans, taxes, and creative expedients that kept the treasury functioning even in the darkest hours. The Republic invented or perfected many techniques of public finance that other states would later adopt, including funded public debt, systematic taxation, and financial reporting that gave lenders confidence in the state's ability to repay. Venice also understood the limits of its power in ways that more ideological states did not, always willing to make peace when the military situation was hopeless, never allowing crusading zeal to override practical considerations, and maintaining commercial relationships with the Ottomans even during wartime whenever possible. This pragmatism was often denounced as cynical or faithless by other Christian powers, but it kept Venice alive when more heroic approaches would have led to destruction. The Republic's military strategy was equally adaptive, focusing on naval power and fortification rather than land armies, fighting where Venice had advantages and avoiding engagements where it didn't, and always maintaining the defensive infrastructure, the arsenals, the shipyards, the fortress network that made Venetian resistance possible. The Venetian arsenal was the wonder of the age, a state-owned shipyard covering 60 acres that could produce a complete war galley in a single day using assembly line techniques that wouldn't be seen elsewhere for centuries. At its peak, the arsenal employed perhaps 16,000 workers, smiths, carpenters, rope makers, sail makers, and dozens of other specialists organized into guilds that passed their skills from father to son across generations. When Venice needed a fleet, the arsenal could produce one with a speed that astonished foreign observers, including Dante, who described the arsenal in the Inferno, and the many diplomats and travelers who left accounts of this industrial marvel. The arsenal was more than a shipyard. It was a symbol of Venetian power, a demonstration that the Republic's commercial wealth could be converted into military capability whenever necessary, and a guarantee that no matter how many ships Venice lost in battle, more could always be built. This industrial capacity was a strategic asset as important as any fortress or alliance, allowing Venice to recover from naval defeats that would have permanently crippled other powers. Venetian fortifications were equally impressive, designed by the finest military engineers of the Renaissance and continuously updated as warfare evolved, incorporating the latest developments in bastion trace design that made them resistant to artillery bombardment. The fortress of Palmanova, built on the Venetian mainland in the late 16th century, was a masterpiece of military engineering, a perfect nine-pointed star that represented the state-of-the-art in defensive design and remained in use as a military installation into the 20th century. These investments in infrastructure, shipyards, fortresses, arsenals, warehouses represented the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the physical manifestation of Venetian strategy, and the foundation on which the Republic's resistance to Ottoman expansion was built. But perhaps the most important factor in Venetian survival was simply stubbornness, a refusal to accept defeat as final. A determination to keep fighting even when the odds were hopeless, a cultural commitment to independence that transcended any rational calculation of costs and benefits. The Venetians knew they were fighting a losing battle against an empire far larger and more powerful than their republic, yet they fought anyway, year after year, generation after generation, because submission was unthinkable and survival was the only goal that mattered. This stubbornness was sometimes foolish. The defense of Candia for 21 years consumed resources that might have been better spent elsewhere, but it was also inspiring, a demonstration of what a small state could achieve through determination alone. The Ottoman Empire, for all its power, never quite managed to destroy Venice, partly because the Republic was harder to conquer than it looked, partly because the Ottomans had other enemies and other priorities, and partly because the sultans eventually decided that a weak Venice was more useful than a destroyed one. A functioning Venice meant trade, revenue, and a buffer against other Christian powers. A destroyed Venice meant chaos, refugees, and the need to garrison territory that was expensive to hold. By the 18th century, both powers had essentially accepted that neither could destroy the other, settling into a cold peace that would last until Venice itself was destroyed not by the Ottomans, but by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1797. Who abolished the 1,000-year-old republic with a contemptuous wave of his hand and handed its territories to Austria in exchange for other considerations. The Ottoman Empire outlasted Venice by just over a century, finally collapsing after World War I, and both powers are now historical memories, their rivalry a footnote in the story of the Mediterranean world they once dominated. The Ottoman-Venetian Wars were not like other conflicts in European history because they were fought not for ideology or religion, but for something more fundamental: control of the sea. The Mediterranean was the highway of the ancient and medieval worlds, and every major civilization, Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Byzantines, had risen along its shores and sought to dominate its waters. Venice and the Ottomans were the last great powers to fight for Mediterranean supremacy, and their conflict spanned 3 centuries because neither could achieve decisive victory over the other. The Ottomans could conquer land with their massive armies, but struggled to project naval power consistently across the sea lanes that Venice controlled. Venice could dominate the waters with its superior fleet, but couldn't hold territory against the overwhelming force of Ottoman land armies. This strategic stalemate produced a war of attrition that ground on 4 generations, consuming resources and lives without ever reaching a definitive conclusion. The human cost of this conflict is almost impossible to calculate, with hundreds of thousands dying in battles, sieges, and naval engagements over 300 years. Tens of thousands more perished from disease in the camps and galleys, where conditions were brutal even by the standards of the age. Entire populations were displaced, enslaved, or massacred as the front lines shifted back and forth across the eastern Mediterranean. The siege of Candia alone may have killed over 100,000 people on both sides during its 21 years of continuous warfare. The fall of Famagusta saw the garrison and civilians slaughtered despite promises of safe conduct, and Bragadin's flaying became a symbol of Ottoman cruelty throughout Europe. The Mediterranean slave trade flourished during these centuries, with captives from both sides sold in markets from Venice to Constantinople. Venetian merchants were enslaved in Ottoman ports, while Ottoman sailors were chained to Venetian galley oars, their fates determined by the fortunes of war. War and commerce intertwined in ways that seem bizarre to modern sensibilities, as Venice might be at war with the Ottoman Empire, while Venetian merchants continued trading in Ottoman cities. The economic impact of the wars reshaped both powers in profound and lasting ways. Venice spent astronomical sums on defense, draining resources that might have been invested in commerce, industry, or the adaptation to changing global trade patterns. The Republic borrowed heavily, accumulating debts that would burden future generations and force desperate measures like the sale of noble titles to wealthy commoners. Trade routes were disrupted by the constant warfare, forcing merchants to seek alternative paths that bypassed Ottoman-controlled territories entirely. The age of exploration was partly driven by this search for new routes, as Portuguese sailors rounded Africa and Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic to escape Ottoman dominance of traditional routes. These new Atlantic trade routes undermined the Mediterranean commerce that had been the foundation of Venetian wealth for centuries. Venice didn't decline solely because of Ottoman pressure, but the wars accelerated this decline by forcing the Republic to spend on defense rather than commercial adaptation. By the 18th century, Venice was an economic backwater, living on past glories, while the Atlantic powers Britain, France, the Netherlands dominated global trade. The Ottoman Empire faced its own economic challenges as constant warfare drained the treasury and strained the administrative system that held the vast empire together. Both Venice and the Ottoman Empire were slowly being marginalized by larger changes in the global economy that neither could control. The military innovations that emerged from this conflict influenced warfare across Europe for centuries. Naval tactics evolved continuously as both sides sought advantages, and the galley reached its highest development during these wars before being superseded by sailing warships. Venetian galleys were renowned for their speed and maneuverability, while Ottoman galleys were feared for their numbers and the ferocity of their Janissary marines. Both sides experimented with larger vessels carrying more guns, and the galleass proved devastatingly effective at Lepanto with its heavy artillery broadside. Artillery improved steadily through practical experience, with naval guns becoming larger, more accurate, and more destructive with each generation of warfare. Fortification design was transformed by the demands of resisting Ottoman sieges, and the Tres Italiens with its angular bastions became the standard across Europe. Venetian engineers were sought throughout the continent for their expertise in fortress design, expertise gained through bitter experience defending against Ottoman assaults. The Ottomans developed sophisticated siege techniques to overcome these defenses, including mining, bombardment, and assault tactics refined through sieges like Candia. These innovations spread beyond the Mediterranean as European armies applied lessons learned against the Ottomans in their wars against each other. The military revolution of the early modern period was partly forged in the crucible of the Ottoman-Venetian conflict. The cultural impact was equally profound, shaping European perceptions of the Ottoman world for centuries. The terrible Turk became a stock figure in European imagination, and Ottoman cruelty, real or exaggerated, was a staple of propaganda throughout Christendom. The fate of Bragadin was told and retold as evidence of Turkish barbarism, inflaming anti-Ottoman sentiment across Europe. But the relationship was never simply one of enmity, as Venice understood the complexity of the Ottoman world better than any other European power. Venetian diplomats spent decades at the Ottoman court learning the language and culture, and Venetian artists depicted Ottoman subjects with nuance lacking elsewhere. Trade created personal relationships that transcended official hostility, and some Venetians converted to Islam while some Ottomans converted to Christianity. The borderland between the two empires was a zone of cultural exchange as well as conflict, producing hybrid communities and shared traditions. This cultural exchange left lasting marks on both civilizations, visible in architecture, art, cuisine, and language. Coffee came to Europe through Ottoman commerce and was first popularized in Venice, while the Venetian dialect absorbed Turkish words and Ottoman Turkish absorbed Italian terms. Venice became the gateway through which Ottoman culture entered Europe, and this cultural role was as important as the Republic's military function. The strategic legacy of the Ottoman-Venetian Wars shaped the Mediterranean world for centuries after the fighting ended. The division of the sea into spheres of influence, Christian West, Muslim East, became entrenched during these conflicts. The Adriatic remained a Venetian lake, even as other territories were lost, while the eastern Mediterranean became an Ottoman domain after Crete fell. This division persisted until the 19th century, when new powers like Britain, France, and Russia entered the Mediterranean arena. The fortresses built during the wars still stand across the region, with Venetian lions carved in stone guarding harbors from Croatia to Cyprus. Ottoman inscriptions mark gates and fountains from Athens to Algiers, and the physical landscape bears witness to this three-century struggle. Tourists today walk through Venetian fortifications without realizing their history, photographing Ottoman mosques built in former churches. The past is layered beneath the present, invisible to casual observers, but ever present to those who know where to look. What lessons can we draw from this extraordinary conflict that consumed great powers for 300 years? The first lesson is about the power of persistence, because Venice should not have survived against the overwhelming might of the Ottoman Empire. By every rational calculation, the Republic should have been conquered, yet Venice persisted through defeat after defeat, always rebuilding, always fighting on. This persistence involved constant compromise, frequent humiliation, and endless sacrifice, but it worked against all odds. Venice remained independent for 3 centuries longer than military logic suggested it could, proving that sometimes survival is victory enough. The second lesson is about the limits of power, because even the Ottoman Empire, one of the greatest powers in history, could not destroy Venice. The lagoon city was too difficult to conquer, its naval expertise too hard to match, its defensive infrastructure too strong to overwhelm. Even empires have limits, and geography, technology, and human determination can level the playing field against overwhelming force. The third lesson is about the costs of endless war, as both Venice and the Ottoman Empire were weakened by their centuries of conflict. Resources that might have been invested in development were consumed by war, and human potential was wasted on battlefields and in galley holds. Both powers declined relative to rising Atlantic competitors who stayed out of the Mediterranean wars and invested in commerce instead. The Dutch, the English, and the French prospered while Venice and the Ottoman Empire exhausted themselves in their endless struggle. The fourth lesson is about adaptation, because Venice survived by constantly adjusting to changing circumstances. When one strategy failed, the Republic tried another. When one ally proved unreliable, Venice sought new partners. When military strength proved insufficient, Venice relied on diplomacy, and when diplomacy failed, Venice returned to arms. This flexibility was essential to survival, as rigid adherence to any single approach would have been fatal. The Ottomans demonstrated remarkable adaptability, rebuilding their fleet after Lepanto in a single year and developing new techniques to overcome Venetian fortifications. Both powers survived as long as they did because they could adapt to changing circumstances rather than clinging to outdated methods. The fifth lesson is about identity, because Venice defined itself through opposition to the Ottoman Empire. The Republic was the defender of Christendom, the bulwark against the Turk, and this identity sustained Venetian morale through centuries of setbacks. The Ottomans similarly defined themselves through expansion, as the empire was the sort of Islam destined to conquer the world. Both powers were shaped by their conflict with each other, and neither would have been the same without their great rival. There is something almost tragic about the Ottoman-Venetian rivalry that consumed both powers. Two great civilizations spent 3 centuries trying to destroy each other, and both failed to achieve their ultimate objectives. Both survived, diminished, and exhausted, until other forces finally brought them down. The energy poured into their conflict might have built wonders, but instead it built fortresses and filled graves. The Mediterranean might have been a zone of cooperation rather than conflict, but that is not what happened. What happened was 3 centuries of war that reshaped the world, but satisfied neither combatant. The last Doge of Venice, Ludovico Manin, surrendered the Republic to Napoleon in 1797 without resistance. The Great Council voted to abolish itself rather than resist the French army, and 1,000 years of independence ended with a whimper. Napoleon dismissed the ancient republic with contempt, stripped Venice of its treasures, and gave the city to Austria. The bronze horses of St. Mark's were carted off to Paris, the arsenal fell silent, and the oligarchs scattered into obscurity. The Ottoman Empire lasted longer, surviving until 1922, but it declined through the 19th century. European powers carved away its territories piece by piece. Greece won independence in 1832, Egypt broke away, and the Balkans fragmented. The empire that had threatened Vienna became the sick man of Europe, and World War I delivered the final blow. Turkey emerged from the wreckage, but the empire was gone, its vast territories divided among the victors. Today, the Mediterranean is no longer the center of world affairs, and the great struggles for its control are ancient history. Tourists visit Venetian fortresses without knowing their purpose and sail past battlefields without recognizing them. The names that once echoed across Europe, Lepanto, Candia, Famagusta, are forgotten by most people alive today. But the legacy of the Ottoman-Venetian wars persists in ways we rarely acknowledge or understand. The division between Europe and the Middle East was shaped by this conflict, and stereotypes that still poison relations have roots in this era. The very concept of Europe as a distinct civilization was forged partly in opposition to the Ottoman threat. Venice and the Ottoman Empire were enemies for 300 years, fighting battles that killed hundreds of thousands. They besieged cities that held out for decades and committed atrocities that shocked even their violent age. And in the end, neither won. Both empires are gone, their rivalries reduced to museum exhibits and history books. The sea they fought over is now a tourist destination, and the fortresses they built are picturesque ruins. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Nothing lasts forever, not empires, not republics, not civilizations. Venice seemed eternal to those who lived within its walls, and the Ottoman Empire seemed destined to conquer the world. Both were wrong, and both are gone. What remains is the human story, the soldiers who fought, the civilians who suffered, the diplomats who negotiated, the merchants who traded. Their stories deserve to be remembered, even as the empires they served have crumbled to dust. Marcantonio Bragadin died horribly in 1571, his skin stuffed with straw and sent to Constantinople as a trophy. Venetian agents stole it back in 1580, and today it rests in a shrine in Venice where visitors can pay their respects. They can honor a man who held a fortress against impossible odds and remember a conflict that shaped our world. That, perhaps, is the best we can do. Remember the past, learn from it what we can, and hope that we can do better